Hi, welcome. I'm Laura Rogers. This is Creating an Approval Workflow Part 1. And it's a two-part couple of sessions that I'm doing. This Part 1 is very, very beginner. And it's for people who are beginners in SharePoint or Office 365. We're going to be going over some very basic concepts, a lot of out-of-the-box concepts. And then the second session after this one will be for people who are already familiar with SharePoint Designer workflows, and it's fairly advanced. I'm not a programmer. It doesn't involve writing any code, but it's fairly advanced as far as it helps to be familiar with SharePoint Designer to be able to follow in the second session. So there's actually a pretty big gap between what you need to know for the first one and the second one, but this is the very, very beginner session. All right. So again, I'm Laura Rogers. I work at Rackspace Hosting. I live in Birmingham, Alabama, and I've written some SharePoint books, and my blog is wonderlaura.com. So if you've never heard my blog, wonderlaura.com, I'll refer to it a lot, especially people ask questions. I'll have detailed information about things. I'll say, oh, I wrote a blog post called this or that, and that's where you can find all those. And I'm WonderLaura on Twitter and a Microsoft MVP for 5 years. Here are a couple of the most recent books that I've written. Beginning SharePoint 2013 Building Business Solutions, and the InfoPath 2010 Step-by-Step book. Microsoft InfoPath, they didn't really change anything from 2010 to 2013, so it's actually still relevant, and the product's sort of going away now, but that was a lot of fun when it lasted. Let's see. So the agenda for today is I'll just give an introduction to just some of the concepts we'll be talking about. And we're going to talk about a lot of sort of requirements, sort of factors that are involved when we talk about putting together some sort of an approval process. Because when the business comes to you, the IT person or the person in charge of the SharePoint site, and they say, we need this piece of paper, we need this to be an electronic form that needs to be approved. Well, there are a lot of things in most cases that they haven't necessarily thought about. They just want it to be on the web. So we're going to go through a lot of those factors that could be involved, things to ask people when they want to have an approval process. And then we'll talk about what your options are in SharePoint, and they're going to range from very, very simplistic to the more complex. And we'll talk about what those will give you and what they won't give you. And we have some pros and cons involved, and then we'll talk about the concept of more real-world scenarios as to basically how complicated it can get with the workflows. All right, so again, business processes are, again, a lot of times they come to you with a piece of paper. They can range a lot in how complicated they can be. A lot of, just more simple ones are just this needs to be filled out and then someone needs to approve it, and that's all there is to it. Or a lot of the times they think that that's all that needs to happen with it. It's a form that needs to be filled out and then approved. And then once you get the business in a room and thinking about it and talking about it and probably arguing with each other, a lot of the times you can just step away and let them argue for a couple of days. Then they realize that, oh, well, when it's Tuesday and Bob is here, then it goes through this process. But every other day, it goes through this person and this person. So it's really important to get that diagram drawn out and really figure out what actually needs to happen in the process. So here are the different factors that we'll talk about for gathering requirements. You're going to have parallel and serial portions of the workflow potentially. So, and I have slides for all these. We'll talk about email notifications versus having a task actually assigned to you, planning out the user interface, branching, which means are tasks going to be dependent on other tasks, and do you have any other sort of systems involved, and then what are the outcomes, what needs to actually happen when people have a task assigned to them in the process. All right, so first of all, parallel versus serial tasks. This top arrow is sort of a combination. So this is super simple. This bottom is just serial. This is just this happens, then this happens, then this happens in order. This bottom kind, this is the absolute easiest to be able to build in SharePoint. This top kind is more realistic. You might have seen these happen in your company. After this task happens, then these two tasks need to be assigned. But then this task happens after this one, but then these two happen after this other one, and this can happen whether or not this has happened or not, and then that's when they start arguing with each other and figuring out what the process is. So this kind of process is much more complicated to build and automate. Okay, so notifications versus tasks. When it comes to workflows, to me, notifications are a lot more simple. So notification is just, someone receives an email to say, hey, it's your turn to do this. It's your turn to go open this thing and approve it. It's your turn to go, create a user account for this new hire, something like that. A task is got more accountability. So a task is going to be, this is an actual SharePoint task and a task list that is assigned to you, and it's your job to not only do the thing that the task says, but then to complete the task. So that's got more accountability around it. It's got an email associated with it, but it's also got more complexity because now you're dealing with the thing, the form that's being approved, and also the task, which is another item in another list. And then a lot of the times, people will do the thing and then forget to complete the task, which holds up everybody. So that's just one more thing that they have to remember to do, is do the thing the task tells you to do and then go complete it. So it makes it a little more work for the end users. But at least you have a list of who hasn't done their task set when that happens. All right, so user interface planning. This is really important, and when the business comes to you with this piece of paper or Word document or PDF of their business form, this is something that they pretty much never ever think about, the user interface. So that means the user interface is what SharePoint site, how are end users going to fill this form out? Where do they go? What SharePoint site do they go to? Where do they go to click to fill out a new form? After they filled out a new form, do you want them to be able to still go to the form? How do they get there later? Do you want them to be able to still see other people's forms? Do you want to make it so they're hidden? So this is just thinking through the whole user interface, and this is a program called Balsamiq, B-A-L-S-A-M-I-Q, that is just a quick little interface builder that lets you drag little shapes onto pages and things to be able to do these kind of things, or draw it on a whiteboard. But thinking through what the user interface is going to be around the form is something that's really important, and again, it's something that people hardly ever think about. And once you start implementing the form in SharePoint, it's one of those things that people usually realize too late. Okay, so branching is another concept. This is going to be sort of like the diagram a minute ago. What are the tasks, and then what happens after each task? So this is going to be the new hire process that I made up. I made my own new hire process up and made up the requirements myself. It was pretty easy. So someone submits a form, manager approves it. After the manager approves it, we have 3 things that need to happen, but they can just happen whatever. They're not in a particular order. So the HR department is going to send the new hire a welcome packet, and IT is going to create a new user account, and the phone department is going to set up a new phone number for that user. And those 3 things can happen at the same time. After all 3 of those things have been completed, then I threw a condition in here. So the condition is, if the user is an IT employee, then we have one little additional step that needs to happen. They have to be set up with security. After that, we have HR approval, and then the employee goes through an orientation process. So as you can see, this is not just a straight list of serial tasks. It's more realistic. It has a lot of sort of different things that are happening with different departments and different people. All right, so another huge factor that, in my experience, the business throws in sort of at the last minute, oh, by the way, we have this other database. That's where it needs to get this certain information as part of the process. Or we have this other database that everything needs to ultimately end up in once the new hire has been onboarded. So that's a very important thing to know up front. So this is, we could have data in the cloud, like Office 365 or Azure. We could have data just in some server. And we can have data, in SQL, Oracle, PeopleSoft, different whatever systems you have in your company. So find out and find out if those are going to be involved, because that will make your process way more complicated than if those are not involved. And it will definitely make a difference when it comes to quoting out how long it will take to build. You guys feel free to ask questions as we go as well. All right, so when it comes to users going through this process and getting assigned tasks along the way, there are a couple of major, different common outcomes that I usually deal with. It's usually approve versus reject, or just complete. So for example, this manager task, the manager actually has to approve or reject that new hire. But then these three things that happen afterwards, those are just, they have to do it. They don't have a choice. They're not approving or rejecting it. They have to go do their thing and then say that they completed it. So those are tasks that someone has to just complete. So again, those are called outcomes. So these are all being completed. HR is actually approval or rejection. So with the approval or rejection, you have to define what happens if they approve it and define what happens if they reject it. And then employee orientation is just something that they say they completed. All right, so now that we've talked about a lot of these requirements, common scenarios you'll come across, we're going to talk about the types of just options that you have in SharePoint, and we're going to start from the most simple options to the more complex. So our options are going to be content approval as the easiest, most simplistic. The next one is out-of-the-box workflows 2010. Now the reason this says 2010 is that even if you have SharePoint 2013 or Office 365, these are still 2010 out-of-the-box workflows. They didn't change at all from SharePoint 2010 to 2013, and they use the 2010 workflow engine. So that's nothing that you need to do or upgrade. They are just their 2010 out-of-the-box workflows, wherever you are. And then task actions and SharePoint Designer workflows are going to be sort of the next, still pretty easy user interface for you to be able to assign tasks in approval process. And then this last option is going to be what we talk about in the next session, where it gets complicated and custom. A lot of times it starts out as one of those, the business thinks it's one of these, and then it gets complicated and you realize it later. All right, so I'll do a demo of the first two, content approval, and the second one was out-of-the-box workflows. So I'm going to go to my travel request list here. All right, can you see that okay? All right. Okay, so this is just a very, very simple SharePoint list. And there's nothing custom about it. It's just a custom list with information about where the person's traveling to. Oops, London. And when they're leaving, when they're coming back. Just pretty simple. So let's see here. And what type of trip it is, so like that. Okay, so the item just gets added to a SharePoint list. All right, so content approval is something that exists in every list and library. In SharePoint, it's been around for a couple of versions of SharePoint. It's simply something that you turn off or on. So I go to list settings here, or if it's a library, library settings. And I go to versioning settings, which is a little misleading. And here it is, require content approval. So I simply change that to yes. Now, this one's important to look at the bottom. As soon as you turn on content approval, it says, I'll scroll down a little, who should see draft items in this list? And then it's basically anybody who can read items, anybody who can edit items, or only users who can approve them and the author of the item. So this has to do with permissions. So you're going to have some sort of permissions on your list. You want people to be able to submit items to the list. So you're going to give them contribute permission to be able to write to that list and submit things. There's also a permission called approval. And by default, it's actually part of if a user has design permission or full control, those are sort of out-of-the-box permission levels. the approval permission is part of those. So inherently, say if you're the site manager and you have full control, you will have the ability to approve things. And I'll talk a little bit about the permission levels in a second. So only users who can approve items and the author of the item will see them. This means, as far as the user interface, an end user goes to the list and they submit something, they can't see other people's things that have been submitted, and their item that they've submitted is not going to appear to anyone else until it's been approved. So that's your sort of layer. You're going to designate who you want to be sort of a moderator of that list, and that person will be the one that can see everything in it and approve and reject, but things that won't appear for everyone who's looking at the list until they've actually been approved. So think about something like a list of company policies, maybe documents that people are submitting to it. Maybe you don't want people who didn't write that particular company policy to see the one that's been submitted. You want to have to approve it before other people can see it. That's how it works. So I turned on content approval. So now what happens? So a couple of things immediately happened when I turned on content approval. I got a new column here called approval status that got added to my default view. And I got 2 more views added to my list or library. I have one called approve reject items. All the items that were in here already just are automatically approved. So it's going to group all the items by this new column called approval status. This view is built for the person who's in charge, so the moderator who's in charge of approving and rejecting items, so they can quickly see the statuses. And then my submissions is for the end users to be able to go to this list and look at the things that they submitted, so they can see what the status is and what's going on with the approval process. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and add a new item to it. So when an end user now adds an item, it says, on this list, require content approval. Your submission will not appear in public views until approved by someone with proper rights. So they can go read more about that if they'd like. So let's see, I'd like to go to Paris, and I'd like to leave today. How about that? I'll put 421. So if I'm gone, you'll know where I went. All right. And then I've got a couple of different types of travel. What is my cursor doing? There we go. I'll just hit save. Okay, so now that this is the first one that I've submitted since I turned on content approval, now it shows as pending. So now on the approve reject items view, they see these groupings. They see that this one is pending. So again, I'll show you the permission level so you'll understand, because this is not going to look the same to everyone. It's not going to look the same to people who don't have that approved permission. When I'm looking at permission levels, I can go to my site settings, and I'll go to am I at the root? Yes. So I'll go to site permissions. And I can look at, there is a default permission level if you have publishing features turned on, called approvers. But you can technically create your own permission levels. So if I wanted to create a special permission level for people to be able to go to that list and go approve things on it, that's possible. You don't have to use one of the out-of-the-box permission levels. So I can even say I want to take contribute. I don't necessarily like going and creating a new permission level from scratch. I usually just go to an existing one and copy it. Just don't go to an existing out-of-the-box one and start changing it. That's very bad, because it affects everything in the whole site collection when you do that. So I'll say contribute and approve. All right, so then approve items. So this is the one little permission that I wanted to show you inside of a permission level. So whichever permission levels in SharePoint or Office 365 have approve items checked, whoever you give that permission level on that list, they will have the ability to do that. So now I've created my own permission level. So I'll go ahead and take this full circle, and I'll go to this specific list, and I'll go ahead and define that I want to give someone that permission level. So this list, I don't want it to get the same permissions that the home page has. I'm just going to stop inheriting permissions. And then I want Ryan to be able to have, let's see, contribute and approve. So a lot of the times in SharePoint we say, try to use SharePoint groups, don't give permissions directly to a person. I'm just trying to show you a very simplistic example. So you could go ahead and create a whole SharePoint group, call it Travel Request Approvers, put Ryan in it, and then give that group contribute and approve. But I went ahead and gave Ryan directly contribute and approve. So that's how you can get that moderator. So that the moderator is the one that's then is going to go to those views. So he will go to approve, reject items. And then he has a special little button here, approve or reject, in his menu. Or he can go to the ribbon, which is funny because the ribbon doesn't really work that well in this particular view. If I go to a different view, I can see it. It's one of those weird residual buggy things from older versions. Okay. Yeah, my web page locked up. Okay, I'm just going to close it and open it again. Okay. This is my virtual machine on my computer. So at least I don't have to rely on the internet. Okay. Okay, so this is the Paris one. So again, I just wanted to show you this button. It says approve or reject. So you're only going to get that if you have content approval turned on. So now I can approve it, make a comment. Lovely, have fun, and click OK. And then this comment is actually another column that I could add to my view if I wanted to. So I could actually go modify my view and it will say approval comments, and then you'd be able to see everything that they had typed down another column. It's just, it takes a little bit of real estate on the page for that. So any questions about the concept of content approval? As you can tell, it's very, very simplistic. It's just you approve or reject, you make a comment, that's it. And people can't see things that haven't been, that are pending. So there isn't anything else that you can customize with that, really. It's just that's what you get. So you might want to, when you're building approval processes, start with this and see if this is sufficient for the business. Because again, when you don't get workflows involved and you don't get SharePoint Designer involved, it's a lot easier to manage going forward and be able to hand off to more business users going forward. All right, so the next demo is going to be the out-of-the-box workflows, the 2010 out-of-the-box workflows. So I'll go over to my IT site here, and I have a document library called Documents. So I'd like to just put a quick, easy, out-of-the-box workflow, approval workflow on this library. I start by going to the Library tab, and I go to, you can't see this, hard to see with this resolution because the button's very small, but it's got workflow settings here. And it also had a little add a workflow button directly there. I'm just going to take you to this workflow settings page so you can see a little bit more information. You have a couple of options here. You can create a workflow that runs on every single item in this whole list or library, just no matter what. Or if you have specific content types, if you're using multiple content types in your organization, you do have the ability of going in here and picking a specific content type and creating an out-of-the-box workflow for it. So you could have, company policies or a content type, and maybe contracts or a different content type, but they're all in the same library. You could give them different workflows. All right, so I'll click Add a Workflow here. I'll pick Approval, that's the most common one, and I'll just say IT Doc Approval. And this is just what I'm naming it in this particular library. All right, task list, there's a task list already on the site. Workflow history list is where it stores things behind the scene. And then how do I want this workflow to be triggered? Do I want it to be triggered when someone puts a brand new file in this library? Do I want someone to have to manually click a button? Or do I want it to be triggered when someone puts a new file on here and every single time they edit an existing file? So it just depends on what your process is. If I say allow this workflow to be manually triggered, that means that that's a little more work for the end user. So usually in the real world, I don't see a lot of these workflows that need to be manually triggered. I see a lot of just, setting it up to start automatically because, again, you don't have to worry about somebody remembering to go click a button when you do that. All right, so I'll go ahead and say this one can be manually triggered. This one can also be triggered when someone puts a new item in here. And this require manage list permissions, this is really just for if you ultimately don't need this to be manually triggered by end users, but you want to be able to test it as you're building it out and trying things, you, as the site manager, you will have manage list permissions. So that means only you, anybody who has this certain permission, would be able to manually kick off that workflow. And that's, again, that's usually just for testing. So, all right. So I'll click next. All right, so who is going to get assigned tasks? So I can put multiple people in here in order. So whatever order I want the emails to go in, whatever order the approvals go in, that's the order that I put their names in this one box. The reason there are two, there's the ability to add stages here. The only reason that happens, it's not because you need to add a different person in every stage. It's really going to be in case you had maybe some tasks that need to happen all at once at the beginning, and then maybe you had some other tasks that needed to happen one at a time after that. So then it would do all of these at the same time, and then it would do this one. But if you just have a straight, a bunch of things happening at the same time or a bunch of things happening in order, then you can just use one row in here. So I don't see a lot in the real world. I don't see people using multiple rows in here. Okay, so another important thing to note is that if you have your workflow so that it is automatically starting when people put something in the library, you definitely want to put some people's names in here, because if you don't, they are never going to be prompted to fill it in. If you're allowing people to manually trigger the workflow, they will be prompted and they will be able to indicate who they want the approvers to be. So if you had, company policies in here and company contracts, and you wanted Nicola and Shane to be the approvers for company policies, a content type, you could create one workflow for them. And then if you wanted Jim Bob and Joelle to be the approvers for the contracts, then you could create a separate approval workflow and put those other people's names in it. So that's how you can kind of mix it up by using multiple content types for those. All right, and then expand groups means if people put a SharePoint group in this list, which I do recommend, because when people come and go from the company, you just add and remove them from the list and not the actual workflow, then you're telling it whether or not you want to assign a separate task to every individual in the group, or if you want to assign one task to the whole group. So think about a help desk ticketing queue where people are calling in with issues and people are being assigned tasks. Usually someone will say, okay, well, I'll take care of this task, you can take care of that task, and every single person doesn't have to do every single task. They're all just taking care of issues as they come in. When you don't expand the groups and you have a single task for a group, the task will actually have a button at the top that says claim task. So when the person decides, hey, I'll take care of this one, they click claim task and then they work on it and their name's on it. All right, so I will ignore that one. So the request box is very important. So put a lot of information in here, because when people first get these emails, they're going to wonder what the heck this is and what it means and why they're getting it, and then they're going to call you. So just put as much information as you can so they'll understand what it is and what they need to do. Okay, due date for all tasks, or you have a hard set due date, or do you have just per task is 2 days? If you have this thing that's just automatically running whenever people add things to a library, it doesn't really make sense to have a hard-coded due date in here because it wouldn't be dynamic, it wouldn't change. All right, so let's see. You can also choose whether you want to reject the document. If anybody rejects it, just reject the whole thing. Or if someone actually changes the original document, do you want that to stop the workflow? Because then it's not the same thing they approved, right? Someone might have approved it, and then someone edits the document. Well, wait a minute, you changed stuff. I don't approve of that. So that's what you can choose here. And then if you actually have content approval enabled on this list or library, you can integrate, this last checkbox will actually integrate the content approval together with your out-of-the-box workflow. Okay, so that workflow has been saved now. And I'll go ahead and instead of creating a new document, I will go ahead and run it on an existing one and show you what it looks like to manually trigger one. And then I'll upload a document and show you what that looks like as well. So to manually trigger one, I have to go to workflows for that item. So let me go back a little and show you where I went. So I can select an item like this in the library and go to workflows, or I can use the ellipsis this way and go to workflows. So when I go to workflows, it's going to let me choose from any workflows that I have that exist on that library. Okay, so IT doc approval. Okay, this is where they're prompted with people's names, dates. They can change any of that if they want to, and then they can click start. So I'll get that one started, and then I'll go ahead and upload another document to the same library. Let's see. Go ahead and open it in another tab to save time, and I'll probably break it. Okay. So documents, and I'll put I'll upload a document to it. Performance metrics, I don't know what that is. There we go. Okay, I have some metadata that I'm filling out, which is irrelevant to this demo, but you'll notice that the first time that a workflow runs, as soon as you've added a workflow to any list or library, the first time it actually runs, a new column will appear. So when you're naming your workflow, try and remember to name it something meaningful, because you're going to have a new column that exists with the name of the workflow on it. So this is, you can go remove the column immediately, but if you want people to be able to go look at the status of that workflow, then that's where they would go click. So if I want to look at the status, go to the status page, I can click this in progress button. I can also click on the item, and I can click workflows like this, and I can go to the status this way as well. So if you remove the column, you're not completely lost. I have this nice little visualization that's built in. It's just a Visio diagram showing on the page. And here are all the things that are happening in my workflow. It shows me these two tasks. I actually set the workflow up to assign those in parallel when I put the people's names in there. So they both got a task assigned to them at the same time. So they will get an email automatically with all the information about the task, with a link to go to the task, and telling them all what they need to do. That's a nice thing about these out-of-the-box workflows, is they have all the emails built in. So then Shane goes to his task, and he approves it. And then I have it on the same status page. I have a whole log here that it's automatically telling me what's going on, telling me what tasks got created, and then who approved it. So look, I can see that it was assigned to Nicola Young, but Laura Rogers approved it. That's a little fishy. So you can see when people are doing things like that, and then when it's done. So as far as the approval process, when you kick off a workflow, whoever manually triggers a workflow, they're immediately going to get an email. I don't have emails set up on my virtual machine. I don't have an Exchange server running or anything. So the person who triggers the workflow will immediately get an email letting them know that they started a workflow, letting them know who the participants are, and then each participant will get an email along the way. And then at the end, the initiator will also get an email letting them know that what happened. Was it rejected, approved, or who did what? So that's what the whole process looks like. Let's go see that other one that I kicked off. Now this other one I kicked off by uploading something and just letting it start automatically. And look at that, it got rejected. Okay, so it started, and then I changed some metadata on the screen when I was uploading it, which was a change in the document. So the workflow had started as soon as I uploaded the file, but then I changed some metadata, and that was considered a change in the document, so it automatically rejected it. So that's a sort of, I guess, a little tip or trick to know that if it immediately does that, that's why it's doing that, because that's just the way I set up the workflow. You would think that SharePoint would know better, but it doesn't necessarily. Okay, so any questions about the out-of-the-box workflows? Yes?
You were saying you can have two different types of documents in the one line. Are you better to set up a separate task list for each document type, or just put them all in one?
That's a great question. He said if you have different content types, you're using different workflows for different content types, is a better idea to have separate task lists for each of those. Well, it kind of depends on what your user interface needs to look like and what you're doing with permissions in that particular business solution. But you will be able to tell the difference in the tasks by the name of the task, maybe. But if you want to be able to have separate web parts in different places for people to go those separate task lists and maybe not have to be bothered with seeing all the other tasks, then that might be a good solution. So yeah. The way that you would do that, what he's asking is when you are in your workflow, so I'll go to my workflow settings, and if I want to edit the workflow I already put in here, I won't see it here until I pick document because I associated that workflow with the document content type. So this is how I could go change it. So I could say new tasks, or I could create the task list ahead of time and call it company policy task list, and then I can call one company contract task list, and then on this screen I would go pick the particular task list for those tasks that are being assigned. All right.
So can we use the same workflow on different libraries? Could you also assign multiple workflows to the same content type?
So his first question is, can you use the same workflow in different libraries? In this case, it kind of is the same workflow because it's an out-of-the-box workflow, but it's not going to, you're not going to have all the same settings that you put in a workflow to move it around between libraries. So the first answer is kind of no, but it's sort of a generic template anyway, if you just use approval, the generic approval one. The answer to your second question, he said, can you have multiple workflows on any one item in a library? And the answer is yes. So you can have one workflow that runs when an item is first created, and you can have another workflow that runs when it's changed. You can have multiple. I found that if you have several, like 2 or 3 or more than that, it sometimes causes conflicts. So I try to narrow it down to having a workflow when things are added and a workflow when things are changed. And when I'm doing that business logic in SharePoint Designer, I just arrange the logic in the workflow so that the actions that need to happen don't collide with each other, just using conditions. Yes?
So is the workflow history for that one instance of workflow running to the document, or does it keep accumulation of history? So if I run the workflow twice in the document, is it going to keep?
So he said, is the workflow history for that one time, or does it keep track of it over time? So when I go to a specific item in here, and I go look at workflows, and I go look at the little status screen of the workflow, it'll say completed workflow that has run before. That's going to be a filtered set of information for when the workflow has run on that one document. But if I go to the hidden workflow history list that you can't get to ever because it's hidden, then I can see everything. So that is actually a list. If I go to my site and I go list/workflow, %20 history. I've written blog posts about this. Then it's a little hidden workflow history list. And that's where it's going to have everything that happened with all of the items. So technically I guess you could have separate workflow history lists for different workflows if you wanted to, if you want to do reporting off of that. Do what? Yes, it's good for an audit. It cleans itself out after a certain amount of time. I think it's 60 days, so keep that in mind. And there are things that people do in PowerShell and STS-ADM to change those settings. It's a little more advanced, but yeah, that's where your workflow history is. Okay. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so the next step in the progression of simple to more complex is going to be the task process designer inside of a SharePoint designer workflow. So when you're doing a SharePoint designer workflow, Some of the types of actions that you can add to your workflow are to assign tasks to people. So in SharePoint 2010, you might have noticed there are 6 different ones, and a lot of times it's very confusing weeding through these and figure out what they do and why there's so many different ones. They made it a lot more simple in 2013. There are only 2. So it's assign a task, which is going to assign one task, or start a task process, which is going to have multiple people involved in that whole process. I like the 2013 concept better, so it's less confusing. So we have some pros and cons, though. So some pros of these task processes are they're easy to set up. It's got an easy user interface. It's got very easy form boxes to fill in, such as who is going to, what's the name of the task, etc., which I'll show you in a minute. It's got built-in notification emails, which is really nice because you don't really have to do anything. It will send an email to someone when they get a task assigned. It will send an email to the next person, and the verbiage and everything's already in the emails. You can actually do overdue reminders. There's just a simple little checkbox to say whether or not you want overdue reminders to go and how often, which I'll show you as well. And you can assign tasks to either to just individuals in a group or to the whole group itself. And you have some configurable task completion criteria, which I'll show you in a second, like did at least half of the people approve, or did everybody approve, etc. Some negative things about these, and this is, when I say cons, I mean when I've tried to use this in real-world scenarios and some of the frustrations that I've come across. Now, this is still better than those other ones I've gone over so far that were even more simplistic that you couldn't customize at all. But these are some negatives that I've gotten stuck on. So you can't set extra task field values. It lets you give the task a name and a due date, who it's assigned to, description, basic stuff. You can't say, oh, well, I have this other field called department, and I want that value to be this. You can't do anything with any extra fields. It gives you what it gives you. There's no lookup relationship to task lists. So lookups in SharePoint are very powerful. When you have one list that has a lookup field to another list, it lets you have sort of dynamic lookups and pull across extra information and things like that. When you have the item that's being approved, such as the document or the travel request, and then you have the list of tasks, there is no actual lookup relationship between the two. So it makes it a little harder to do anything that involves a dashboard that shows common items or having a workflow that knows which items are associated with which items. Tasks delete themselves after 60 days, which is kind of a shocker if you didn't realize it was going to do this, because all of a sudden you thought you were going to use these tasks and report off of them, and then they're gone. So after they've been completed and it's been 60 days, they disappear, and you have no control over it. And it's difficult to do varying task titles and descriptions, which means that if I have, for example, HR onboarding, I want the first person to do an approval, and I want the second person still doing an approve reject, but maybe I want to word that second task a little differently. There isn't a way to do that. It's just everybody gets the same task title in that process. Parallel tasks are extremely challenging. Just in general. So when you have a very simple serial process that's just this happens, this happens, this happens, these are fine. When you get anything more complicated, it's very difficult. So I'll demo this now that I've given the caveats. Okay, so I've got, let's see, this is my, okay, I'm going to go to my marketing site, marketing projects, and I have some documents here. Let me see. Marketing projects is a library, sorry. Okay, so I have marketing projects. I have things in a library that are in folders, but I also have them in different views. I like views with no folders, etc. So this is my library that I'm going to put the workflow on. So I need to open this library in SharePoint Designer. So I'll go in Site, and then this is Marketing. And I go to Workflows. All right, so when I go to Workflows, I want to create a new workflow on the Marketing Projects library. So list workflow is just the most common. You pick which list, or it says list, but it's lists or libraries. So I pick marketing projects and I name my workflow. I'll say approve project files. And it's a SharePoint 2013 workflow. If you are on-premises SharePoint 2013 and you start to create a workflow and you notice that you don't have SharePoint 2013 workflow as an option here, you just have 2010, it means that your SharePoint server administrator did not install SharePoint 2013 workflow on the server. That's it's an extra step that the server admin has to go through in 2013. It's not just going to magically be there. Has anybody had that happen ever? Okay, yeah. So I will go ahead and one way to add an action in a workflow is to click the action button and go pick one. I can see task actions here. Or since over the years I've gotten more and more familiar with what the actions are, I can just start typing kind of what I think is in the name of the action and hit enter, and it will quickly give me a short list of whatever search word I typed. So this is a task process. And it's very different than the task process designer in 2010, by the way. It works a whole different way. All right, so very easy user interface. I just click on the blue so I can configure it. And it's got nice, easy boxes for me to fill out. So I can say who the participants are. I'll just say Brittany and then Ben. And again, just put them in the order and pick whether it's serial or parallel and give it a task title. So one important basic thing to know about SharePoint Designer workflows is what you'll see a lot is this ellipsis right here, the 3 dots next to a FX little function button. So here's what those do. When I click the function button, it's going to let me pick a value. So I can go pick maybe the file name or the file type or the title of whatever the current item is. Maybe I want that to be the task title. And I'll go delete what I just did. If I pick if I just type in here, I can just say this is an approval task. But when I do that, it's just hard-coded. Every single task is going to say this is an approval task. So that's why I like the ellipsis so much, because when I click the ellipsis, I can combine free-form text with dynamic information from that item. So I can say approve this project file. And then I can insert the name of that file. So I can combine multiple things in here. All right. And then the description, I can say, please do this. And again, make it very descriptive. If I want to have more dynamic information in the description, I can do the same thing with add or change lookup and put more information in here from that item. And here's the due date. So I'm going to skip the due date. I know I've got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to skip the due date because it's actually more complicated than it should be with these. Let's see. I'm going to pick, does this have it's got a project date, so I'll just pick that for a date for now. Okay.
Forgive me, that description is more a message body, is it, rather than the description of the...
The description is not really a message body. I'll show what the messages are going to look like. So the description is going to be the description that is in the task itself. I'll show you where that displays in the email. So task options, when I expand this, it gives me a lot more information here. So this is the task completion that I mentioned. You will want to wait for all responses, first response, a specific response, or a percentage. So no matter whatever I change this to, I have more options. So if I say if 60% approve this, then it's considered approved. So that's a great option that I have that I didn't have in previous versions. Email options. So this is what the email looks like that they are going to receive automatically, and you can just change it here. So I can go put things in bold, I can add more verbiage to it, and it has the description here as part of the email. All right, I can say whether or not I want to send overdue emails, and I can even see what that looks like. It looks kind of the same, except it's got a little red text in there, so I can tweak that a little bit, maybe put it in bold. All right, and then I can even say how often I want them to get an overdue, daily, weekly, monthly, how many times, etc. And then whether it's approved or rejected, or if I have a different outcome. So I'll go ahead, and I'm not going to send emails with this one. because I don't have emails on my virtual machine. And in 2013 workflows, you have to put a go to something at the end of your workflow before it lets you publish it. So I'll just say go to the end of the workflow. I have some more options. So this is sort of just a little bonus with SharePoint Designer workflows, is I can go to properties on any action I had, and I can go see several more options. This is a fairly new one that they added fairly recently in like the second version of Workflow Manager, waive assignment email. So you want to waive assignment email if you don't want them to get an email when they first get a task assigned. And then I want to waive the cancellation email. So it's kind of a reverse logic there. All right, and then so those are all I wanted to do, and click OK. So then, again, with all SharePoint Designer workflows, I have to decide how I want that to be triggered. So this one, I'm going to allow it to be manually triggered, or just when an item gets changed. So I'll just say when an item gets changed and publish it. Now, again, I've told you I've had issues on my virtual machine since I don't have email, and a lot of the things that SharePoint Designer workflows do, they rely on email. So we'll see how well that works. But I'll go ahead and change something. So I'll go modify some properties. And I'll go change this to 8.1, like that. And it should trigger the workflow when I save it. Okay, that was the conflict of interest. It should actually add a column for my workflow as well. So I'll refresh this a little. It's so hot in here. Oh, I know. Okay. All right, let's go see if it ran. I'll go to workflows and approved project files. It's started and it's in stage 1. So look at that. So the first task got assigned, and it's showing me the task right here in my workflow status page. Notice that there's no workflow history. So that's another important thing to know about SharePoint Designer workflows as opposed to that little out-of-the-box one, is that it's completely up to you as the workflow designer to put logging information in here. And you're going to be doing that using the logging action in the workflow. So after a task process is done, I want to say log, and then I want to say stuff happened. And a lot of the times I'll do, after every single action in my workflow, I'll say log this, log that. So that way my workflow history will have something in it, especially for troubleshooting, so I'll know what's going on in there. So with this one, all that's happened so far is a task got assigned. So I think I assigned them to 2 different people. This is kind of ugly compared to the 2010 ones. The 2010 ones use InfoPath when you're enterprise. So I went ahead and clicked the button to approve that one. And let's see, I'll refresh this page. And then the second one got assigned. And we'll go approve that one as well. So notice that I had a field called project date, and that was the one that I used as the due date. Very quickly, I'll go back in here and show you the sort of trick to get around the fact that the due date, it doesn't have an add 1 day, add 2 days to tell you how long you want people to have to be able to do their task. It's just put a date here, and that's it. So what you can do is, the first thing you can do is what I did and just pick a date field from your library. But what I like to do is do a variable, which is a little bit more of an advanced concept, but it's going to give me a date that's variable, related to today. So that's actually an action called add time to date. So I can say add 2 days to, I'll just say now I will just use the current item's modified date, because that's usually when they modified it, they're doing this. So I'm just going to add 2 days to when they last modified it. And my variable called date, that's what I can use as the due date. So a variable in a workflow is something that's temporary information that the workflow is holding on to while the workflow is running, that you can use in different places in your workflow. So for example, the date variable is something that I can go in here and now use in here. So due date, I can go pick workflow variable like this. So now it will be due 2 days from now. Another variable concept is this variable outcome. So the outcome, after that task process is run, that's going to give me information about whether it was approved or rejected. So if I want anything different to happen in my workflow when it was approved versus when it was rejected, I have to do things. I have to build that. So I have to say, if variable outcome equals approved, send this email, otherwise send that email, etc. And so it's a little bit more work to do when you're dealing with the SharePoint Designer workflow, but at least the task process designer gives you a lot of this stuff built in with creating the task for you, sending the email for you with a few simple options. Okay, I know I've got 4 minutes left. Let me go. I've got just a couple more slides.
I really liked your blog that you do of replacing the workflow history. Yeah, that's your blog, isn't it?
Oh, yes. She said.
Where you put it on a separate list.
Yes, she said she liked my blog post that I wrote on doing a different workflow history. So that the blog post was really about, I think it was based on troubleshooting one that was broken and I had to create a new one, but that blog post in my workflows category on my blog will be there. Yeah. All right, and then so this last slide sort of leads you into real world scenarios, which is what the next session is going to cover with more complex things and how I like to try to accomplish them in your workflow. All right, and here are some more resources. So especially if you're not going to the next session, I actually did 7 hours of recorded me building the whole thing from scratch. So it's on YouTube, and I wrote a blog post about it too. I called it an HR onboarding process, but in my blog post I went and I listed all the links to the videos and what I do at every step in all the minutes of the videos. It took a while, but it was kind of fun just doing it live, just recording it, because it's a lot easier than writing a book and having to write all that stuff out and do screenshots. So I'm kind of lazy. But thanks everybody for coming.